Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. It's Ukraine War news update, third part thereof for the 16th of April 2024. It's another packed news day because there's so much going on. Obviously we've got the Iran-Israel conflict, but also Mike Johnson and what his declarations have been concerning the four prospective bills that we might see, and what I think is a bad set of options compared to the existing Senate bill. Anyway, we'll go to John Kirby here saying, I guess, similar things in different ways to what Lord Cameron was saying, David Cameron, when he was interviewed concerning, well, what's the difference between sending UK jets up to support Israel in defending against Iranian drones and not, why are we not sending those airframes up to defend Ukrainian airspace? How does that work? John Kirby asked the same thing, said different conflicts, different airspace, different threat picture. The president has been clear since the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, USA is not going to be involved in that, which is not wrong. So this is correct. It is a different airspace, different conflict, different threat picture. What I would just like to hear is a bit of honesty. I know they don't want to say these things openly, but it's just like, yeah, they've got nukes and Iran doesn't. So we're going to help Israel if that's all right. I know there are other components in that political calculation as well. Just, yeah, I mean, that's what this can be boiled down to. Yep, slightly different geography. There are other nations who are protecting their airspaces, Jordan, etc., etc. But different conflict, different airspace, different threat picture. They ain't got nukes. Talking about what's going on with Iran and Israel, and I'll connect this to Ukraine just afterwards. So Arab countries is a quote from Wall Street Journal article that Shashant Joshi is excerpting. Arab countries quietly passed along intelligence about Tehran's attack plans, opened their airspace to warplanes, shared radar tracking information, or in some cases supplied their own forces to help, officials said. In other words, there's been this rather unexpected scenario where many Arab nations are supporting Israel over an opponent who is, you would think, otherwise ostensibly allied to those initial Arab nations due to the fact it's a Muslim nation, right? But herein lies the complexity. You've got Sunni Islam in the Arab states and Shia Islam in sort of the Persia area, Iran. And that is going to be a significant difference there, differential. Quote, Israel's move into CENTCOM was a game changer, making it easier to share intelligence and provide early warning across countries, said Dana Stroul, who until December was the most senior civilian official in the Pentagon with responsibility for the ME, Middle East. Despite the progress, the US goal of having Israel and the Arab states seamlessly share tracking data on Iranian threats in real time has never been fully realized because of political concerns, officials said. And importantly, says Joshi, quote, 2 days before the attack, Iranian officials briefed counterparts from Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries on the outlines of timing of their plan for the large-scale strikes on Israel. So I don't know what was going on there, whether Iran knew that information would get back to the States, or whether those the Iranians were sharing that information with were like, yeah, we're going to use that, and we get some leverage with the US and, I don't know, some brownie points or whatever. Just fascinating to think what must be going on behind the scenes in conflicts like these. Yeah. On top of that, this, right? Quote, Russia wants to transfer air defense systems and Su-35 fighter jets to Iran to strengthen Tehran's defense against airstrikes by Israel or the United States, according to the Washington Post. There's a lot of people talking about this at the moment. In fact, let's find Thomas Tyner has just also weighed in on that. If Russia provide S-400s and Su-35 fighter bombers, then this is a real game changer and could really work against, I think, Russia in the long run here. I'll explain that in a second. So Thomas Tyner just adds to this idea of all of these nations, these two nations of Iran and Russia getting together as a bit of an issue. An issue for the Russians and Iranians. So he says that would be excellent. Russian Air Force plus Iranian Air Force versus the Israeli Air Force is going to end in the complete annihilation of the Russian and Iranian Air Forces, especially if any of their aircraft come within range of Israel's David's Sling fire units. Okay, so I don't know the likelihood of it coming to something like that, but what is important, I think, here is the political ramifications to Russia supporting Iran, because it's all about America. Right? What you have at the moment is a group of Republican MAGA politicians who are against giving aid to Ukraine, but are very much for giving aid to Israel against Iran. Which means the Islamic Republic are the bad guys, super bad guys, and no one can dislodge that from our framework here. That is baked in. Okay, so Iran are the bad guys. Now Russia are supplying Iran with munitions to defend against Israel or to attack against Israel. Right, because I was just on the side, effectively, of Russia against Ukraine. So now that's complicating matters. And actually, this would be really useful, I think, for unifying the Republicans and Democrats against both Iran and Russia. So if Russia are to provide assistance to Iran, this would be very useful for the Ukrainians, I think, in the long run. So interesting situation brewing there. Now, moving on, we're going to go to Poland here with Radoslaw Sikorski, the foreign minister, saying, "You are fighting for your life. We empathise with you," Ukrainians that is, "and we know it's dramatic, but you also need to understand us. We cannot use violence against our farmers." In other words, he's just recognising that they're in a really difficult situation, that he, as much as anyone else in Poland, knows how important it is to support Ukraine as much as possible, but the Polish are having their issue with the farmers and the hauliers, and you can't just, lock them up, arrest them and move them out of the way. There needs to be some lasting solution to the issue on those border checkpoints. Indeed, Polish farmers have blocked Ukrainian grain imports since November 2023, hitting Kiev's war-battered economy. Top Polish trade expert Piotr Sorojczynski explains the roots of this crisis. So I won't go into the original article, but I'll just say he says most nations protect their own farmers, with high EU crop standards making cheap Ukrainian imports unfair. Lacks oversight of grain marked as industrial goods are later sold as food into Poland, and that has shocked farmers. Polish truckers also allege Ukraine hauliers exploit wartime EU access to steal freight, so to rob freight, as in to get cheap freight going and take advantage of a wartime situation. And the expert blames Kiev's delay seeking trade deals and asymmetric demands. Nobody likes Ukraine pushing the EU to pressure Warsaw, he says, urging dialogue. So there are genuine issues with the farmers and the hauliers in this situation, and they are potentially being exacerbated by Ukraine, who are desperately trying to get advantageous situations for themselves and for their own economy that is basically on its knees. And here we have it. So then when you have those base problems, you have Russians coming along, no doubt, and amplifying these grievances and exploiting them for their own ends, and maybe funding them or promoting them online or whatever. And there are some connections there, but it's not to deny that there are some issues at base here for those polls. Moving on, we have Tord Ara Iversen here saying, rather direct message by the Norwegian foreign minister in Kyiv today. None of us does enough. We all need to do more. We need to do better. We need to think more strategically about how we can help Ukraine to win and hence Russia to lose. A few other quotes. You will not win the war with air defences, but it's an important prerequisite. I also belong to those countries in Europe that think that Ukraine also needs to be able to strengthen its capability to strike behind enemy lines. And I think you're talking about hitting not just in occupied Ukrainian territories, but also into Russia. After mentioning the F-16 donations, he said, that's from Norway themselves, there might also be other contributions to a more sort of deeper strike capability, which I think is imperative for Ukraine. So now we're starting to get some really interesting developments there if Norway can somehow support those deep strikes. Because I have long said that one of the best ways for Ukraine to win this war is to be able to strike long and hard and a lot. If they can use missiles and drones to cause all sorts of damage in occupied Ukraine and Russia, then they could bring Russia to its knees without losing many soldiers. They can absolutely hammer logistics. They can just do that till the cows come home. They can take out equipment at a distance without having to commit soldiers. You only need men and soldiers really to take back men and mechanized equipment to take back territory, to have your people there to flush out the Russians and then take hold of that territory and then administer it, right? But before you start doing that, you just want 6 months, maybe a year of just absolutely hammering everything. You want, if Ukraine had literally tens of thousands of really good munitions, missiles and drones, naval drones, and they were sinking ships and hitting logistics and taking out air bases, just do that for a year, then Russia would not be able to do anything. Of course, we can get onto the whole Putin paradox that I talk about quite often, which is he's then likely to do something nuts. But, either Ukraine are going to win this or they aren't. And to win it, I think you just need to be absolutely hammering the Russians behind the lines. And that's why the development of the Neptune R360 missile, that anti-ship missile that can fire apparently 1,000 kilometers and it's being manufactured at a tenfold increase, is so significant, because it's also indigenous and you don't have any worries about, that's a US or UK weapon being used inside Russia. Anyway, he continues, we are with you not only as long as it takes, but in order to make the outcome what you want, namely to win and expel the Russian aggressor from your lands. And I think that's really good. Really good rhetoric. Obviously, it's all about following up rhetoric with tangible aid and behaviour and activity, but more than almost anyone, the Norwegians are doing that. Norway, Denmark, the Baltic nations, Nordic nations are doing a really fabulous job in supporting Ukraine. The atmosphere outside of Parliament building in Georgia is yet again, very much like this. So lots of flag waving, lots of protesting what the government is trying to do in enact a law that is very similar to laws that have been enacted in places like Hungary and Russia, and to get an increased iron grip on the democratic mechanisms in the country and processes, procedures. So they are coming out in force, the Georgians, and have been for a couple of days to protest this. They're singing songs and chanting with Georgian and EU flags there. But I tell you what, it's not looking good. So this is what happened in Parliament. A brawl broke out in the Parliament of Georgia after the opposition leader, so this is him, Aleko Elisashvili, attacked this is the Georgia Dream Party being attacked by an opposition party member, attacked the leader of the parliamentary majority from ruling Georgian Dream Party, Mamuku Mdinadradze. So I don't know how much this is going to help their political battles to try and get this law, not enacted. So there you go. That is some pretty hefty politicking going on there. I don't know that I condone that. That's not going to get anything achieved, and it will only end up getting him, I guess, kicked out of his position there and probably hand more power to Georgian Dream. I don't know. But that shows you how these things are running. Tensions are running really high. Police have mobilised special forces outside the Parliament building. I believe there might even be water cannons there and whatnot. People are protesting, but people are also getting carried away in heavy-handed tactics from the police. Russian puppet government of Georgia isn't taking this anti-Russian protest laying down, calling in the goons to crack skulls on the streets of Tbilisi, says Jay in Kiev. So, yeah, plenty of videos out there of the protests, and then what law enforcement is trying to do to crack down on them is all a bit of a worry. French aid from Ukraine says here, a brief political interlude. In the run-up to the European elections, the French political arena has escalated in recent days and weeks. To caricaturize the situation, there are two camps. And this is our segue into talking about this with regard to European politics, and we're going to look at a fascinating article in, I think, is it the New York Times, about the influence that Russia has on far-right politicians in Germany, in the AfD. But we're going to start here with France. So there are basically two positions. The majority of pro-Ukraine or pro-Ukrainian voters and politicians are in the centre. The others are the extreme left and extreme right. On the one hand, it's we support Ukraine, and on the other hand, it's Macron wants to send our young people to be killed in Ukraine. So that's how they're trying to sell this as like not being the right route to go down, is taking what Macron said about the possibility of French troops ending up in Ukraine, but now it's by people who are anti-Ukraine, it's like he's going to send our troops to die. The MP for Renaissance, who is Violette Spilbu, was a victim of a campaign by young communists to incite hatred against her support for the security agreement between France and Ukraine. And so this is how it is. It's about splitting, or it's about essentially centrists are generally more likely to be in support of Ukraine, and the far right, as I've said, have been whipped up by Europe, but also the far left can be as well. I just think it's harder for the far left unless they are outright communists. If they're outright communists, then of course there's that Russia connection, kind of culturally, historically, politically. But if you're, say, a far left green or a far left progressive, I think that's very different. And I think those far left progressives are actually quite likely to support Ukraine, or they're going to be outright pacifists, and they're more likely to be anti, say, supporting of Israel, and if those two conflicts get mashed together, then you've got issues. But I think you generally are going to have more issues on the right, due to, in the EU particularly, it being about far-right populism. I would argue that's the case with the MAGA republicanism as well, but far-right populism, as I've said many times before, they are weaponizing the Russians' immigration as a grievance in the EU, as a way of sowing discord in the EU and promoting disunity. And indeed, this is what we see in the New York Times article. The far right's ties to Russia sow rising alarm in Germany. As cases proliferate, opponents fear the Alternative for Germany party is becoming a tool of Russian influence operations to undermine support for Ukraine. Now, this is also the case in other parties, and there's been a recent investigation started as a result of the reports from the Polish and Czech intelligence services that have found a number of politicians are in the EU have been in the pocket of the Russians. Anyway, we're going to pop into a little bit of this article. In the past few months alone, a leading AfD politician was accused of taking money from pro-Kremlin strategists. One of the party's parliamentary aides was exposed as having links to a Russian intelligence operative, and some of its state lawmakers flew to Moscow to observe Russia's stage-managed elections. Quote, "To know with certainty that sitting there, while these sensitive issues are discussed, are lawmakers with proven connections to Moscow, it just doesn't make me comfortable. It worries me," says Erhard Grundl, a Green Party member of the Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. So he's sitting on a committee talking about foreign affairs and how Russia's getting involved and is a challenge to Germany. Meanwhile, he's sitting with people who are basically in the pocket of the Russian state, arguably. As evidence of the party's links to Moscow accumulates, suspicions are being expressed across the spectrum of mainstream German politics. Quote, "The AfD keeps acting like the long arm of the terrorist state, Russia. Roderick Kiesewetter, the deputy head of the Parliament's Intelligence Committee and a member of the centre-right Christian Democrats, wrote on social media. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022, Europe has struggled to fend off influence operations by Moscow aimed at weakening Western unity and resolve. The worries extend beyond eavesdropping and spying to include Moscow's ties to political parties, especially on the far right, which are proving to be useful tools for the Kremlin. In Germany and elsewhere, that alarm is only growing ahead of elections at the European Parliament in June. This is what I'm so super worried about, as many of these parties are expected to have their best showings ever. Now, I think hopefully as you are with me day after day after day and you're understanding where I'm coming from, these are all the issues I've basically been espousing for the last 2 years. And nothing, it's quite, I'm sort of patting myself on the back in a sense by saying that there's nothing that really goes against, like, I don't think I've been wholly wrong in my political analysis of the broader challenges to, I think, European and Western security, and the idea that the Russians are undermining European and Western unity, I think, is just becoming more and more apparent. Each passing week, we are getting more and more pieces of the jigsaw that paint this picture of massive Russian interference that's now been going on for a decade, right? And it's only now that it's becoming overtly known. And I think some of the final piece of that jigsaw is that connection to American politics. And we'll come on to speak about that in a little while, because actually Anne Applebaum's just written an article sort of concerning that as well. Anyway, the AfD, which is against weapons deliveries to Ukraine and calls for an end to sanctions on Russia, is not only vying to become the second strongest German party in European parliamentary elections, is poised to become the leading force in 3 eastern state elections in Germany this autumn. That gives the AfD the possibility, albeit still unlikely, that it could take control of a state government. Quote, this would be a whole new situation with regard to Russia, where the people making propaganda, passing information, could also actually be in power, said Martina Renner, a lawmaker from the left party who sits on the Parliament's Domestic Security Committee. So here we've got a De Linke party member, I think that is, sounding off about the challenge of the far right. So she's obviously not quite on board with Russia having that influence. And I think this is a huge worry. These European elections coming up and certain state elections and national elections are just ripe for the picking for Russia. And you start getting a movement of AfD politicians that gathers momentum. You start losing Germany, who are presently the biggest donor to Ukraine, as a major supporter of Ukraine, where it becomes increasingly more difficult to get things passed through. And you get this groundswell of support for AfD, and with that, this kind of process of osmosis where they pick up other aspects of AfD. So you might get a lot of people supporting AfD who aren't necessarily anti-Ukraine, but the more they live in that ecosystem, in that information echo chamber, they will just pick up those ideas by osmosis, and after 6 months of living in that information space, they end up being anti-Ukrainian and have not really realised, a bit like boiling a lobster boiling in a pot. You know, they're just slowly coming towards their kind of moral death as they start espousing more and more problematic ideals. But in the wake of the war in Ukraine, the article continues later, mainstream lawmakers have expressed regret for those ties, and most have cut them off. But while many lawmakers in the AfD instead appear intent on deepening them. So this is the idea that the German SPD has had connections to Russia previously, but they've done a much better job of shaking them off and saying, it appears that Russia suck, and we're going to admit that now. But AfD are they're doubling down. On Friday, the Belgian authorities announced they were starting their own investigations into the reported payments of European lawmakers. Some of the loudest suspicions have been voiced against Peter Bystron, an AfD member of Parliament, German Parliament, Foreign Affairs Committee. In 2022, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Mr. Bystron led AfD lawmakers in demanding to know why the German government had not fought for the freedom of a pro-Putin Ukrainian oligarch, Viktor Medvedchuk, whom they described as the most important Ukrainian opposition politician. Now, if you were watching my interview with Sean Pinner yesterday, who was arrested and tortured, he was swapped for Viktor Medvedchuk. Him and a bunch of others. It wasn't just one for one, but this is the chap who was touted as being the Russian puppet leader of Ukraine. If they had succeeded in either assassinating or deposing Zelensky, here was your man that was going to be in charge instead. And that's who the AfD were lobbying the government to free because he had been kind of unfairly arrested or whatever. Absolutely incredible. Anyway, going back to talk about Mr. Bystron, he and several AfD members are now among those suspected of receiving payments, the authorities said. They have so far been not brought any charges against anyone. Mr. Bystron's office did not reply for a request by the New York Times for comment. Last week, Mr. Bystron, who is an AfD candidate in the European elections, described the case as a kind of conspiracy against the party. Quote, before every election, it's the same defamation with the help of the Secret Service, he told the AfD-linked website Deutschland Courier. But of course, I would argue, no, it's the fact that you guys are dodge. Konstantin von Notz, a Green Party member of the head of the Parliament's Intelligence Oversight Committee, called the accusations against Mr. Bystron the tip of the iceberg. So there's a lot more. 2 months ago, an investigation by The Insider and Der Spiegel published what it described as communications over an encrypted messaging service last year between Vladimir Sergiyenko, an aide to the AfD member of parliament, and a Russian intelligence operative. Purported encrypted communications between Mr. Sergiyenko and the intelligence operative discussed AfD plans to file a lawsuit aimed at stalling or stopping the German delivery of arms to Ukraine, including much-needed tanks, by charging that the government had failed to seek parliamentary approval. He told the operative the plan needed media and financial support, according to the report. And last July, the AfD filed such a lawsuit, but the party said it had nothing to do with Mr. Sergiyenko, who has also called any accusations of ties to Russian intelligence fictitious, even though there are these encrypted communications, although they are purported. A top aide to Tino Chirapla, a leader of the AfD, published an article in an obscure website connected to Alexander Dugin. So it's more than just taking a bit of money. This is a philosophical, political alignment with Russian nationalism. Alexander Dugin is a philosopher behind so much of Putin's thought processes, a right-wing ideologue whose concept of a Russian world, the Ruski Mir, helped inspire Mr. Putin and the invasion of Ukraine. Mr. Dugin has popularized terms like Euro-Asianism, and now feature in the rhetoric of many AfD figures. So you've got this kind of infection of AfD thinking with the I guess the viruses of Russian nationalistic philosophy. It's all just very worrying. And then more things to report. And it just goes on to say, since then, there have been many AfD delegations to Russia. So they've gone to Russia a number of times. And this for me, tells you everything you need to know about AfD. One member of parliament even wanted to open an office in Moscow, but backed away after remonstrations from fellow lawmakers. Why would you want to open an AfD, like a German political party office in Moscow, unless you had deep ties to frickin' Moscow? Absolutely unbelievable. Anyway, this is all fascinating and worrying, deeply, deeply worrying. So all I would ask that if you are coming up to vote in the European elections, don't vote, just even if you have to hold your nose, even if you agree with what some of these right-wing parties are arguing on other matters, just on Ukraine, don't vote for anyone who's pro-Russian. Please don't vote for any of these parties. Just go centrist for this time and just go, just keep a bit of stability and let's keep a bit of moral support for Ukraine. Now, moving on to the US and how this might look in the US, this is just such a worrying piece of data. 79% of Republicans in a poll were found to trust Trump for accurate info about the Ukraine war. Are you serious? It says CBS News poll. As Republicans against Trump say, Houston, we have a problem. That is incredibly worrying. That they trust the State Department 27%. They trust Trump 79%. What do I feel about Ukraine? I know. I'm going to see what Donald Trump puts on Truth Social. That's what I'm going to judge. That's how I'm going to evaluate my international geopolitics. Ooh. Of course, I talked to you about Marjorie Taylor Greene and her claim it's anti-Semitic to make Israeli aid contingent on funding Ukrainian Nazis. These should be separate bills. And I love it here because the Chief Rabbi Bleich has come back, just someone in the know about anti-Semitism. You know, I know a few things about this, being a Chief Rabbi. There are no Nazis in Ukraine, just Russian invaders. Russia is targeting Christians in occupied Ukraine. The Russian army has destroyed over 400 Baptist churches. MTG, what do you got to say about that? Stick that in your pipe and smoke it. Yeah? So, well done, Chief Rabbi Bleich. Now, Jay in Kiev mentions that it's really significant that now we are starting to see mainstream television channels and anchors start to talk about the issue of the infection of Russian ideology and talking points and narrative inside American politics, particularly in with those fringe politicians who are becoming less and less fringe as the months go by. Now, this is Joe Scarborough, who's admittedly on MSNBC, which is your left-leaning channel, but he's a former Republican lawmaker himself, so he's had an interesting journey, and he sees things from being that previously that Republican.
Willie, when members of the Republican House GOP are saying they're Putin propagandists, leaders of the Republican Party's foreign policy apparatus inside the House are saying they have become dupes to Russian disinformation. Or, I don't know, are they dupes? Why would somebody from northern Georgia start spouting Russian propaganda points? She's not a dupe, is she? Why would, I'm just curious, why would other members of the House Republican Party start spouting Russian propaganda? I don't have any answers to this, though I am fascinated by it. I know there's been some talk in Russia some talk in Europe, that some European politicians have actually been on the take from Russia. That explains that. I don't understand, though, why politicians from Dalton, Georgia, are spewing talking points from Vladimir Putin and RT. Russian television. Very, very strange times when, I'm not saying this, I'm quoting the Republican who runs the Intel Committee.
Turner.
I'm saying this. I'm quoting the Republican who runs the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Turner and McCall.
Very strange times indeed in the Republican House.
Mike Turner, the chair of the Intel Committee, a Republican, said publicly in an interview on CNN last week he hears direct Russian propaganda from the mouths of the Republicans on the floor of the House. That's from him. He's a Republican talking about his colleagues there. And it is a fair question. Why?
Why?
What's going on? And by the way, you could take that argument, as we have for almost a decade now, all the way to the top. Why does Donald Trump defend Vladimir Putin at every turn? We've never fully gotten to the bottom of that, but it does seem many of his minions in the House are following his lead on.
This is what concerns so much of my thinking on a daily basis. And I know I sound like a stuck record, but when we have 7 months of no aid to Ukraine other than some presidential drawdown authority amounts, which, 300 million here, 200 million there, but compared to what the US has planned and what's got through to the Senate, that is a drop in the ocean. When we've had 7 months of that, and then finally Mike Johnson announces there will be a bill, but it's going to be split into 4, and then it's going to make it much more likely that it's hugely delayed for Ukraine and then might not get through either the House of Representatives or the Senate, then you know that there's something else going on. Now, Anne Applebaum in The Atlantic has written a piece, why did the US planes defend Israel but not Ukraine? Going back to this idea we were talking about previously, but I'm only going to dip a little bit into her article. She says, one difference is the balance of nuclear power. So I've talked about that before. Russia has nuclear weapons and its propagandists periodically threaten to use use them. That has made the US and Europe reluctant to enter the skies over Ukraine. Israel also has nuclear weapons, but that affects the calculus in a different way. It means that the US, Europe, and even some Arab states are eager to make sure that Israel is never provoked enough to use them, or indeed to use any serious conventional weapons against Iran. A second difference between the two conflicts is that the Republican Party remains staunchly resistant to propaganda coming from the Islamic Republic of Iran. Leading Republicans do not sympathize with the mullahs, do not repeat their talking points, and do not seek to appease them when they make outrageous claims about other countries. So interesting that they don't repeat the Iranian talking points, they do repeat Russian talking points. So why is that? That enables the Biden administration to rush to the aid of Israel because no serious opposition will follow. By contrast, the Republican Party, including the presidential candidate, does sympathize with the Russian dictatorship, does repeat its talking points, and does seek to appease Russia when it invades and occupies other countries. The absence of bipartisan solidarity around Ukraine means that Republican congressional leadership has prevented the Biden administration from sending even defensive weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. The Biden administration appears to feel constrained and unable to provide Ukraine with the spontaneous assistance that it just provided to Israel. Open sympathy for the war aims of the Russian state is rarely stated out loud. Instead, some leading Republicans have begun in the past few months to urge that Ukraine should, quote, shift to a defensive war, to give up any hope of retaining its occupied territory or else stop fighting altogether. Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, in a New York Times essay written, and apparently that was a terrible essay that someone was telling me in one of the threads. They started reading that and it was just so full of erroneous claims that they couldn't even get a fraction of the way through it. In a New York Times essay written in what can only be described as an extraordinarily bad faith, made exactly this argument just last week. So too, for example, did Republican Representative Eli Crane of Arizona, who said that military aid for Ukraine, quote, should be totally off the table and replaced with a push for peace talks. So you have a Republican representative saying there should be absolutely no aid to Ukraine and they should be forced to do peace talks, which means we would be forcing them to give up the territory to Russia, because if they're forced to do peace talks now, they wouldn't have that leverage. And Russia would. That is an American politician saying we should force another country to capitulate to the demands of Russia. If you don't find that utterly horrific and politically scary, we're going to be talking past each other. Like, I know it sounds like I'm being partisan here, but explain to me how other way I should interpret that. Like, I don't get it. There's this purchase that Russian narrative has within the GOP, certain elements of the GOP, that is unbelievably worrying. Applebaum continues, but Ukraine is already fighting a defensive war. The material that the Republicans are refusing to send includes, let me repeat it again, defensive munitions. There is no evidence whatsoever that cutting off any further aid to Ukraine would end the fighting or bring peace talks. On the contrary, all the evidence indicates that blocking aid would allow Russia to advance faster, take more territory, and eventually murder far more Ukrainians, as Vance and Crane surely know. Without wanting to put it that boldly, they seem already to see themselves as some kind of alliance with Russia. And therefore, they want Ukraine to be defeated. Tell me and tell Anne Applebaum how to interpret in any other way. That is the only way to interpret that. And so why is it that they are so freaking compromised, morally and politically, by their desire to appease some pro-Russian positioning? They do not see themselves in alliance with Iran, despite the fact that Iran and Russia would regard one another as partners. And this then goes back to maybe one of the best ways of getting them on board with supporting Ukraine is for Russia to go in to militarily support Iran. And then these guys will suffer cognitive dissonance as their core beliefs that Iran are the bad guys, but Russia are kind of good-ish, or Ukraine are the bad guys, then, those two ideas can't work. I'm going to have to harmonise them. They don't work together. So maybe that means we need to defeat Russia as well as Iran. Okay, maybe that's the way into getting support for Ukraine aid. Hopefully my analysis there makes sense. US expands sanctions against Belarus. So where the US is doing really good work, or trying to do really good work, because it's so difficult, is in terms of sanctions and trying to twist people's arms around the world. And they're working, I think, tirelessly to do things like that. The US has expanded sanctions against Belarus. The latest sanctions package targets entities that profit from Russia's war in Ukraine, including a state-owned machine tool building company, a radio telecoms firm, and a software company. And now we're going to... all of this needs to be seen in light of the hegemonic chess game that's going on around the world. And so we have really picked two sides. You could pick the US, or pick some kind of, and with that you can have the EU, or pick BRICS, or basically China with Russia. Now, I have for many years said, well, I'm not a big fan of American imperialism, capitalistic imperialism, that I think has done some pretty horrible things in South America over the last 70 years. I think there's been some clandestine unseating of democratically elected governments just to suit corporate agendas, so on and so forth. So I am anti that kind of thing, and I have long recognised that. But I like to be a little bit nuanced, at least, which is to say that, yeah, but it doesn't mean I'm then going to jump in with and get into bed with Russia and China. Because I look at them and go, yeah, even all that, which I don't like elements of that, is a lot better than all that. And we are getting to a point where we're having to pick sides. It's like, yeah, okay, there is nuance, but at one point we're either with them or with them. In this big tussle for hegemonic superiority. Now, Jon Stewart on The Daily Show, which is a comedy show, had a fascinating interview, 17 minutes of, and he tries to put in a couple of gags in there, but actually this is serious stuff, with David Sanger, and I want to read this book. It is now on my list of things to get, because this is right up my alley. And if you're interested, it should be up yours, but I'll try and summarise it for you if you don't want to get it. But anyway, this is talking about that tussle that I was just mentioning, and the idea that, yeah, maybe the Americans, to some degree, or that whole kind of worldview has been a kind of element of making a rod through your own back. But let's see how the conversation goes here, after already sort of 10 minutes of deep conversation.
Haven't we sowed the seeds of this with our own arrogance and cavalier approach to a lot of these foreign policy conflicts? We always frame things as this is a battle between democracy and the free world and liberation and authoritarianism. But the truth is, we're fighting for trade channels and resources. Like, this is all a function of competing capitalist powers. And aren't we the ones? I mean, we've invaded more countries than Russia and China combined. So how do we give ourselves somehow the pass as the white hat guys when a lot of our policy has created a lot of the chaos that they're taking advantage of?
So unsurprisingly, his audience are really behind that. And it's absolutely true. It's a really salient point. It's like, you know, imperialistically, the US has gone through the last 70 years, like, claiming this is a war on terror, or claiming this is a war for democracy. If you go and see John Pilger's documentary, The War on Democracy, that will explain a lot of this. Not war on democracy was what I didn't mean before. I meant a war for democracy. So they often, the Americans and the British along with them, and other nations who go along with that, say, yeah, we're trying to get democracy in place. So you look at someone like Iraq and weapons of mass destruction, and you think, and then you look at Libya, and you look at Syria, and you look at all these places, and you're like, okay, how much oil is around there? What do we have that's of interest there? Okay, a lot of oil. And trade routes and all sorts, like you said, trade routes. And why didn't we go in and stop Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe? Because that was pretty terrible leadership going on there, and that was a hell of a job for the people living there. Through that, no natural resources. We weren't interested in that place because it didn't offer any benefit for us to get involved. And so you've got to understand that we go around the world getting involved in conflicts but not all conflicts. Some conflicts because we can get something out of it, and it is because that is what power is about. That is what influence. I've done this before. I talked you through a quote from a book from what was it, 1930 book or whatever it was, of the guy that said, look, I was in the armed forces for all this time in America, and I just went to all these places just so that we could get corporate influence in all of those places and make lots of money out of it. So I was worse than Al Capone. He only operated in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents, and that's the reality of what our armed forces do. Yeah, they are about trying to promote democracy and police the world, but they do that in ways that are beneficial for our national interests. And our national interests, this is not criticism, this is just the reality of how life works. Our national interests are about economic interests so that we can get money in, so we can pay for our welfare state and our people can live in prosperity and happiness and blah, blah, blah. And that's kind of what Jon Stewart is talking about.
I'm done. I'm out of here.
So there's been a lot of that going on in American history for a long time. Teddy Roosevelt, took over his fair share of territory. But I think in the Biden administration, we've had to sort of face these contradictions, because at the beginning of the administration, the president was saying just what you said. This is a battle between democracy and autocracy. And everyone said, okay, that's pretty clean. Then he goes to...
Just not true.
Yeah, then he goes to Saudi Arabia, does the fist bump with MBS, right? And I was on that trip. They weren't quite sure how that was.
Are you ever home?
When you cover the White House, you got to go where the president goes. It's part of the job. And then, we move on to what's been happening in Israel and the Israel-Hamas war. And as you said earlier, we are in the very odd position of both providing aid and providing the arms that are being dropped on Gaza. And I think this administration has had the hardest time trying to go right that, and obviously is causing a lot of pain, not only for Gazans, but for people in the administration who are having a hard time living with it.
Would it simplify our position if we stopped pretending our morals were beyond the reproach of all these other countries? Would it help us to not have to scold everybody for failing to live up to principles that we very clearly do not uphold?
Well, at least we have some principles, okay? That's the one thing
Well,
that
we
to
say
be said.
that, but, you can't invade a country. What happened in Iraq?
That's right.
You can't call for regime change. What did we do in Libya? Every time we say these things, we undercut our own position with, for God's sakes, Iran is an enemy today because we overthrew their democratically elected government in 1953.
That's right.
So at what point do we just admit that this is how we're behaving?
The odd thing is, at the moment that presidents do admit that, they get chewed up for admitting to American error. Obama went and apologized to the Iranians.
I'm not saying apologize. I'm just saying, take off the mask and go, you know what this is? It strikes me as it's colonialism and imperialism in a more modern form. China is in Africa trying to extract. We're trying to extract. We're militarizing economic rivalries and creating all kinds of chaos and death over what is ostensibly trying to get better deals.
Well, some of it's better deals. Some of it is protecting technology. And I argue in here that with China, as opposed to Russia, this is, first of all, this is an incredible competitor. And it's a competitor in the military sphere, in the technology sphere, in finance, in economic.
And we're their best customer.
And they are ours.
Right.
And that's really what makes this different from the old Cold War. There's a reason there's new in new Cold Wars, and there's a reason there's an S at the end. First of all, we're fighting 2 simultaneously. Okay. The old Cold War, that wasn't the case.
Is fighting the wrong terminology, because isn't that, look, the only people that never lose a war are the military-industrial complex, are the people that sell the weapons. And if we continue to, if we continue to push that, weaponization of these economic rivalries, aren't we just playing into that cycle?
We are playing into the cycle, but if you're in a world in which vacuums happen, if we say, okay, We're done.
And this is a great point, because it's very easy to say, oh, it's a military-industrial complex, they're making a profit out of this. But he's right. Like, if we step back and go isolationist, then there's a power vacuum, and like, it's either us or it's some other person. If that's some other entity, if it's some other entity and they are worse than us, then that makes the world a worse place. So rather us, with our imperfections, trying to do at least something of a good job of it, whilst also lining our pockets in whatever way we do by having this global status, then better us than them.
With this, you're going to go back and build our big walls and sort of recede from it. Someone fills that space, and that space is going to get filled largely by China, some by Russia, some by other authoritarian regimes. And so we've got to make a really hard and bad choice, which is, do we want to be the one trying to fill that void with our technology and our principles, understanding that we violate them all the time? Or do we want to let an authoritarian regime go fill that space, which we know how that's going to look?
It seems like what we should do is be honest about what our aims are, in the way that China went into Africa and did Belt and Road, knowing that really it's about cobalt and lithium. And rather than us going into Africa and just building up all these small military juntas that end up creating all those dictatorships that create so much chaos and pain for those countries.
Well, I'd argue that now we're not doing it with cobalt, we're doing it with semiconductors, right? So the big story that we tell in here, went to Taiwan, spent a lot of time at Taiwan Semiconductor, which is the biggest producer of the most advanced semiconductors in the world. And, looked at the question, does that create a silicon shield for the United States and for Taiwan? In other words, that the Chinese would not dare take over Taiwan because they would lose access to Taiwan Semiconductor.
When are we going to learn any sentence that begins with "would they dare"? Yes, they would dare, and so would we.
And so my argument here is, it's a silicon shield for a little while, John, but eventually the Chinese are going to learn how to make everything Taiwan.
Which they are, and so is the US.
At that moment, we've got a real Taiwan crisis. And so the book is sort of a warning ahead to what these next 20 or 30 years are going to look like. Because this is not a world in which these new Cold Wars are going to end sometime soon. They are going to be the dominant theme of the next 20, 30, 40 years, long after Putin and Xi are gone, and long after Joe Biden and Donald Trump are gone.
And such a good discussion. I love it. I love that Jon Stewart's got that on the comedy show. What a great discussion. And this is about what the kind of world is that you want going forward. So then when I look, if I was an American and I was to look at J.D. Vance and Eli Crane espousing what they're espousing, I'm thinking, dudes, you are on the wrong side, and you are obviously on the wrong side here. Like, in any way you're going to evaluate what's going on, even if you hate American imperialism, unless you're a dyed-in-the-wool, like, authoritarian lover, like, you're still going to be backing the US in this, or the US and allies, or the Western world in this attempt to get, global superiority. Let me know what you think. I just thought that was a really good discussion that goes to the heart of almost like the philosophy behind it, like the goal of why are we doing anything in the world where it's for economic gain and it's for power and blah, 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 blah. Talking about China, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz says he will be discussing achieving a just peace in Ukraine with Xi Jinping in China. So he's visiting China at the moment. Is it just me? Is this perspective? Is Xi Jinping standing in front, further forward from Olaf Scholz? Or has Xi Jinping got a head twice the size of Olaf Scholz? Is Xi Jinping just a huge human? I don't know what's going on there. Anyway, in that context, during his visit to China, Olaf Scholz officially asked President Xi to put pressure on Russia so Putin stops his insane campaign, withdraws his troops and ends a terrible war. Whether that will work, I don't know. Let me know what you think. I think there's some really interesting big ideas on today's show, today's video. I know it's meant that it's much longer, but I think hopefully richer for being so. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.